my guest tonight is William Cumpiano. He is a luthier who specializes in fretted and plucked string instruments. Hey, William, buenas noches, good evening. Welcome to Tertulia. How are you?
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here before you again.
Long time no see,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, many years ago we had a conversation also. So I'm so glad that you're back, and we are going to speak about your field, with guitars, right? Building guitars, making guitars. Now I know that you were born in Puerto Rico, San Juan.
In San Juan, yes.
And you went to school there, high school?
No, I was raised in the suburban town of Rio Piedras, where the University of Puerto Rico, well, the first University of Puerto Rico is. Now there are many in Puerto Rico, but it was the first one in Rio Piedras.
And that's
Puerto
close to
Rico.
San Juan?
That's in greater San Juan metropolitan area. Rio Piedras is including Carolina and other places. But Rio Piedras is now part of San Juan.
Okay, all
Wasn't
right.
then.
Very good. And then you went to New York to study, to go to college.
Well, when I graduated high school in Puerto Rico, I went to art school in Brooklyn, New York, and I got my design degree there.
Design degree. And what kind of specializing?
It was industrial design,
Industrial
which
design.
is the merging of business and art. It's a very specialized field of well, you could talk about that, what industrial design is, but let's talk about guitars.
Right,
instead.
yes. So speaking of guitars, what inspired you to change fields?
Well, little did I know when I was a child growing up in Puerto Rico, 3/4 of a century ago, and being exposed on the street to the radio and the jukeboxes that were always playing the romantic bolero trios. And then when I went home, my mother was a professor at the university, and my mother was very close-minded about music. She thought that if it wasn't Bach or Beethoven, it was trash. And she said, "You're listening to that trashy music." But anyway, so I got both. I got the music of the street, and I got the music of the parlor, of the academia. So I had a little bit of both. A little did I know that then that those same sounds of plucked instruments, of guitars in the bolero, and then when I would eat lunch every day in elementary school, I'd go and I'd listen to, I would have a mixta, which is the typical stewed chicken and rice and beans. There was a large bus stop, and all the bus drivers would congregate in this little fonda, this little restaurant. And in the jukebox, you could hear Ovidio Gonzalez singing his décimas, backed up by Arturito Aviles playing the cuatro. So I was brought up with these sounds and this music from a very early age. But little did I realize back then, that I would then spend 55 years pursuing the mysteries of the guitar and trying to master the guitar. Little did I then. And here I am, almost 80 years old, and I'm still fascinated by these little singing cabinets. And that's what happened. And as far as how I made the jump between the real world and the universe of the guitar was because I had graduated in furniture design, and that put me in a position at the right time, or the wrong time maybe, to be working on Madison Avenue in New York City in a design studio. And this was the same time as, remember that TV show, Mad Men, with that crushing culture, that terrible culture. I was in the middle of that. I was on Madison Avenue in a design studio in this environment. And after my whole educational career had come to this juncture, and here I found myself in an office on a drafting table in that culture and hating it. I was just so unhappy. And serendipitously, I was living in New York, serendipitously, I came to know a man who was making guitars. And that was fascinating to me because just like everybody else, I thought that guitars were things that just emerged from the back of music stores, that somehow they just appeared magically in music stores. Well, the fact is that in the United States, guitars are produced historically in a very different way from the way they did in Europe. You know, the guitars originally evolved in Europe, and then they came to the New World with the Spaniards first. Well, the tradition in Europe was that if you wanted a guitar, you'd have to go to a maker, somebody who would make a guitar, who made guitars. They made guitars in small quantities, and there were small studios, small shops. And there'd be a guitar maker in every community or every town or every city, and he'd supply in a small studio. But the tradition in the United States was completely different from that. That tradition of small hand builders never occurred in the United States until I came into the scene, because it was just starting in New York City during the early 60s. Mm-hmm. Before that, guitars were made by the thousands in large factories. It was a product of the Industrial Revolution because all the immigrants that came from Europe established in the United States from Germany, mostly Eastern Europe, and they were building the guitars that were being made in Eastern Europe, and they established themselves in Chicago and New York City, and they opened factories where guitars were made by the hundreds at the time. And that was that was the way that you bought guitars. You didn't go to a builder. You went to a store, and they had warehouses filled with these guitar-shaped objects that were designed specifically to be made in large volumes. Mm-hmm. And that was the tradition. Yeah. But when I, just by chance, came into that world in New York City, that was only starting, this artisanal tradition was only starting in the United States in 1960. There were mostly ethnic builders, like Italians, Puerto Ricans. Some of the great guitar makers that later became the great giants of hand building were Puerto Rican. Manuel Velázquez, Tito Baez, Efraín Ronda. These were people during the 30s and 40s that were starting to first to build like they remembered in the old country how they were made. So anyway, just by chance, I bumped into an Armenian guitar maker who was starting. He was making lagutos and Armenian string instruments, but he had opened a guitar store, and he was offering a course in guitar making at the Craft Students League as a night course. And the thought was so fascinating to me that somebody could actually make one of these things, and not that it was being hammered out by the hundreds in a factory, but somebody could actually fashion this, kind of like Geppetto, making these Pinocchios that would then jump off the table and start dancing and singing. Was just fascinating to me. And at the end of the course, I actually, my first guitar building this course was terrible. It was just unplayable mass of mistakes. He saw the effort that I put in, and he said, look, the state of New Hampshire is inviting me and giving me a backing to open up a small studio in New Hampshire to try to bring more commerce to New Hampshire. But none of my workers want to leave New York City. So if you want a job, I could train you and pay you minimum wage if you would move to New Hampshire with me, and I'll teach you. And I was thinking, well, I was working up the ladder of success. I was making a lot of money in New York City. I had a nice apartment. I had a girlfriend. I had a dog. I had making a lot of money, but I was hating what I was doing. And I made a kind of the decision that you can't make at this age. You can only make when you're 20 years old. I said,
Exactly.
sure.
Yeah.
And I moved to New Hampshire into the Gurian workshops and have been following this since then.
Never
And
look
that was,
back. Never look
that was
back.
the early
Yeah.
70s
Yeah.
from now. So it's 30, 50, 55 years that I've been doing this.
That's a big change for
And-
you from
and-
coming from Puerto Rico to New York and
Yes.
way all the way up to New Hampshire.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's good.
And
So,
then back to this area here
Yeah.
after that.
yeah. And how many years were you in New Hampshire? Several
Just
years?
several
Yeah.
years.
And that's where you learned most of your trade?
Yes. Well, when I was working with Gurian, I was only making his guitars. That is, just the ones that he was designing.
Mm-hmm.
But then I left with his foreman, and his foreman and I formed a partnership. And out of my barn in New Hampshire, I had bought a small house and I had a little workshop.
Yeah.
We were building guitars that we were making, just the two of us, that we were then driving to New York City and selling out of this store
Yeah.
in New York City.
Yeah.
And that was the
Wow.
beginning of this process.
Oh, how fascinating is that? Wow. So let's continue with our conversation about guitars now. And just a brief description of luthier, the word luthier, because that's what you are. And many
Yeah.
of us don't know exactly what it means.
Well, it's a word that describes a profession, just like, say, a cooper is someone who makes barrels, and a string fellow makes strings, and a Wainwright, wheelwright makes wheels. Well, a luthier is a maker of string instruments, and it comes from the French lute. And from the French, it actually arrives to the French luthier, Luthier. But that comes from the Persian al-ud,
Yeah.
al-ud,
Uh-huh.
which is the origin of the word lute. In Persian,
Yeah.
al-ud is the wood, because all string instruments originate in ancient Persia. And there were two kinds. There were the instruments that were made with the tops made out of wood, and the other family they were made out of stretched skin, so something like the banjo.
Yeah.
So los aludes or laudes or lutes
Yeah.
were the ones that were made out of, the tops were made out of wood. So from wood to luth to luthier to alud to luthier. That's how that word
that's what
evolves.
that word. So, and you are a luthier.
A luthier, right.
Yeah, good,
Specifically
good.
a
Yeah.
maker of string instruments made from wood.
Yeah, so that's where the guitars actually originated, because most of us think, oh, it comes from Spain, but it came more like from the Middle East.
Well, the Middle East was the birthplace of all stringed instruments. And of course, the Arabs and the Persians and the Moors
Yeah.
obviously conquered most of Europe at a certain time, and they were in Spain for 950 years. The Moors that were originally from the Middle East,
Yes.
they ruled Spain, and they brought with them the two families of string instruments, the ones with the round backs that were called lutes, and the ones with the flat backs. And those were the two forms, string instrument forms. Well, after the Catholic kings got rid of the Moors in 1492, they so despised the Moors that they forbid any round-backed instruments.
Really?
And those actually became the ones in Europe, but not in Spain. Only the flat-back instruments survived in Spain, because the Catholic kings forbid the round-backed instruments, because they reminded them of the Moors.
Of the Moors, yeah.
So that was the flat-backed string instruments were the ones that came to the New World with the sailors, and the lutes. The round-backed lutes came with the European conquerors, but this flat-back ones came with Ponce de Leon.
Yeah,
And Ponce de Leon was the first governor of Puerto Rico.
that's right, yes.
So we know that these instruments also came, the simpler, more coarse, roughly made ones came with the sailors and the workers and the farmers. As the Spanish colony spread all over Latin America,
Right.
they came with the dictate of the Catholic kings, that ordered all the colonists to bring stringed instruments with them, because that was the way the Catholic Mass was observed, was with stringed instruments. So that's how so many string instruments got established all over Latin America. And they came mostly with the sailors and with the workers and the soldiers. And they developed in very particular and peculiar ways in each country, in each colony. And in Puerto Rico, it evolved by forming the cuatro.
Cuatro, that's
And,
right.
and in Cuba, it was the
The
tres.
tres, uh-huh.
And in Colombia, it was the tiple. And in Mexico, it's the jaranas. And all these instruments proliferated. And whereas United States could say, well, there's no real native string instrument that was born in the United States, say perhaps the banjo.
The banjo, right.
But that wasn't even native. That came from Africa, because the
That's
banjo
true.
is an African instrument. They came with the enslaved West Africans.
That's so true.
All you could think is maybe 3 or 4 instrumental forms evolved in the United States. But Mexico, 30 different string instruments forms, each peculiar and particular for every region. Dozens and dozens of forms. And, one of my projects for my retirement is write a book about Spanish instruments, and I've been gathering that information for many years now. And it's a huge universe of different instruments with large and small and all kinds of fancy shapes and all kinds of different arrangements, but there are just a plethora of them all over. In Puerto Rico, people just know about the cuatro, but there are also almost a dozen string instruments that disappeared in Puerto Rico, and the cuatro is the only survivor. And that's one of my extracurricular activities, which is to try to resurrect and to restore interest in all these disappeared Puerto Rican string instruments.
And did those disappeared Puerto Rican instruments look like the cuatro, or were they completely different?
Well, they were chordophones, like the original models that came from Spain, but they were all different sizes and different stringings, different tunings. They were made from all kinds of different materials. But they were native. They were actually sprung from the native aesthetic and musical, the needs, the peculiar musical needs of each community. And that was very outstanding. Well, now there's a soprano string instruments that is now becoming popular as a result of not only my efforts to restore it. It's called the tiple. And the tiple, it's a long story. We won't, maybe we'll have time later on to get about the tiple. But no, the cuatro is part of that long historic process.
Yeah. Now the cuatro, cuatro in English is 4, so most people would think, oh, it has 4 strings, but that's not the case, is it?
The cuatro has 10 strings.
10 strings.
And that was the question that nobody in Puerto Rico, when I started to ask, nobody in Puerto Rico knew the answer. Why is it called a cuatro when it has 10 strings? And we even went to the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, and they gave us a made-up answer. Nobody had done the research.
Really?
Nobody. And it's part of the colonial strategy that all the old traditions and all that they were never interested. It was never emphasized in academia. It had no importance because it sprung from the lower classes, from the working classes. So it was of no interest. The musicology in Puerto Rico and the research was for European music, or what they called, quote, primitive music. That was what musicologists were interested in, never in popular music, never in the music of the people, until just recently. Now there's a new field in musicology within the last 20 years of actually studying the instrument of the people, not just of the classical European music, and say the real primitive Aboriginal musics.
Right,
but now it's that the music of the people is just only recently being able to study. So that was one of the reasons, a mixture of colonialism, that all these traditions were lost and so many instruments disappeared.
But did at any point el cuatro have four strings, or it
Yes,
never did?
the cuatro first evolved as a four-string instrument, and it followed the lineage of a medieval instrument made in Spain that had four strings, that was tuned. The strings, the intervals, the tuning intervals between the strings was the same. And this was, by the way, the result of research that me and several other nostalgic Puerto Ricans in the United States did with our Proyecto del Cuatro Puertorriqueño that we pursued as an extracurricular activity for 20 years. And we finally discovered, we went back and since the academia was not doing that research, we did it ourselves. And we found that the cuatro was a four-string instrument that started to fade in the 19th century and was eventually replaced by a new model. That new model was inspired by a revolution that was happening in mid-19th century of a new wave of instruments coming out of Europe that had doubled up metal strings. That strings were in what they call courses. There were 5 double strings or 6 double strings, and the 2 little double strings were played as one, and they were played with a pick rather than with bare fingers.
Yeah.
And that was the second family. The first family in Spain was the instruments that had single strings mostly and were played with the bare fingers, like the guitar, and had a figure 8 shape. But there was a whole other family that were pear-shaped, and they were usually smaller, although they were of different sizes too. And they were played with a plectrum or pick. Well, those instruments were a result of evolution, of natural evolution in Spain in the 19th century, and they were called, where the first instruments were called laudes. This was the nuevo laudes and the bandurrias, and las bandurrias. And they were pear-shaped, and they had plucked, doubled strings. And so they were played in a style called tremolo, where the little plectrum would be played very, very quickly, which is a style. So the instrument would buzz, would play the music in this trembling sound. But what was such a big hit in the 19th century that caused huge changes in the instrumentarium of all Latin America and the United States, by the way. At the same time, it was a hemispheric hit in the 19th century, were traveling orchestras, string plectrum orchestras of dozens and dozens of musicians called estudiantinas.
Oh, yeah.
And the first one was called the Gay Figaro Students. And they were dressed up in a medieval garb, mimicking medieval students that would have to play for their, like beggars. They were musical beggars that were students. And they would play light classical music, and you'd have a stage full of dozens and dozens of these tremolo, plectrum, double-string instruments. So what you'd listen to as a stage is this wave of buzzing music, and it was just it was like a magical noise, and it made such a hit that they were traveled all over Latin America. They traveled all across the United States, leaving behind a craze, a mandolin craze, and a bandurria craze in Latin America, and a mandolin craze in the United States during the early part of the 20th century. And every city, and I'm sure that even in Springfield, there was a mandolin orchestra, a plectrum orchestra. New York, Milwaukee, every city had developed a plectrum orchestra that was developed from this. So what it caused in Latin America is all these old rustic instruments that had been looking the same for hundreds of years, all of a sudden evolved into this new modality of doubled metal strings that were played with a pick. And that is how the American steel string guitar evolved, the 12-string guitar in Mexico. In Puerto Rico, the cuatro was put aside and gained 5 doubled up strings or 10 metal strings. In Cuba, the original 3-stringed tres evolved into 6 or 3 double strings and became the tres. In Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, all over Central America, all Mexico, these new bandurrias appeared. And we made the link because the intervals between the strings were the same as the bandurrias. So the first modern cuatros that everybody plays and loves today, plays Christmas time, and are now playing jazz and are being heard all over the world in playing Irish music, and even in Japan there's people playing cuatro.
Oh, really?
They were played in the same intervals between the strings, and these intervals are like the DNA. If you follow the interval patterns of the strings, you can trace historically a thread to where these instruments were born through these patterns of the interval tunings between the strings.
Wow,
And
that is so fascinating. Now let's remind our listeners that the cuatro is the musical instrument that it's like an icon of Puerto Rico, right?
yes, it evolved as a symbol of identity.
Yeah.
And that was necessary. Most colonized people embrace icons, because it reminds them that their culture is unique. It's not the culture of the dominant culture of the colonial culture.
Exactly.
The Irish have their harps. The Scottish have their bagpipes. And these are these simple objects that take on a very special social value, that they're held as ultra valuable objects that bring emotional memories.
Yeah.
And we find that to a large extent in Puerto Rico with the cuatro. And there's always a flag nearby. There's always, the cuatro is always associated with the jibaro, the original subsistence farmer. And it's part of the colonial process that these icons are so important.
Now, can we speak briefly, because we're coming towards the end, briefly about the types of wood that we use for guitars? There are so many myths out there that sometimes if you buy the most expensive wood, this guitar will be the one with the best sound.
Right. Well, that is, if I've learned something in my 50 years of pursuing these mysteries, because there's still a lot of things are still mysterious, I've come to the conclusion that the actual species of wood that you choose is of far less importance to the ultimate quality of sound and playability of the instrument than the care and the design and the precision that the instrument is made under. And that what determines how the instrument will serve as a tool for the musician, as an effective tool, and will create the most, to be able to take that very small energy from the vibrating strings that create an effective sound transformer, that it's a machine that starts with the kinetic energy of the vibrating strings and ends up as acoustic energy in the air that eventually hits our ears. The actual species of the wood is of far, far less importance than the care and precision of the builder, experience of the builder, and the attention that the builder puts into it.
Right.
And
so, which kind of wood? Just now
well,
that we know it's a myth, is the most expensive one.
Well, part of the lore is that the more expensive and the rarer, and the better it is.
Right.
But that's absolutely not true.
Right.
Yes, the more expensive ones tend to be the ones that are more colorful, more interesting to look at. But as far as a guitar as a tool for the musician to make music and create precise and inspiring music, there's a large number of less precious or less noble woods that do the job. And because of the fact that this myth has caused that many of these woods are no longer available, they were absolutely stripped. The forests, the South American forests, the Central American forests have been stripped and are now highly regulated and controlled, that you cannot, these very precious woods have been farmed out, It's against the law to use them in commerce.
Really?
And now the inevitable is happening. The new philosophy is that forests are now to be managed in a sustainable way.
Uh-huh.
So now it's a new world, the world of the supplies, the wooden supplies, the wood supplies for musical instruments, that they come from sustainable forestry, which is a recent field.
Yeah,
And even in
very
Puerto
good.
Rico and in the Caribbean forests. And believe it or not, that there's more forests in Puerto Rico than there were at Ponce de Leon's time.
Is that right?
Yes. So and that's because of the sustainability
That's great.
and practices that have become modern practices. And the woods that are much more economical and less precious, which are absolutely the equivalent of the most expensive rare woods, like walnut, cherry, maple, sycamore. These woods are wonderful, wonderful, beautiful woods that I've been promoting, and other people too, and are necessary because the old traditional woods, which were not technically superior, or that maybe the grade, the amount of improvement was arguable.
Yeah.
Arguable.
Yeah.
So now it's a new world when it comes to the whole wood supplies for the musical instrument industry.
That is so interesting. We are going to have to continue our conversation some other time with so much information that you have. This is so fascinating, William. I'm really, blown away by so much information. And are you still teaching, giving classes?
Yes, I'm only a couple of years away from retirement. I've halved my day. I tell people that I'm partially retired now. I'm not accepting new customers. All my work you can see on my website, www.cumpiano.com.
Can we spell that, please?
That's C-U, M as in Mary, P as in Peter, I-A-N-O, Cumpiano. My family comes from Italian immigrants to the Caribbean in the 19th century, from the city of Cumpiano in Italy, Genova. That's my early
That's where
ancestry.
you come from. Yeah. So it's Cumpiano.com.
Yes.
Very
And you
good.
could see all my work. And the fact is that I am still teaching, but my work is at a much lower level now. But I'm still doing research.
You have books coming up?
Yes. Well, me and my old partner John Nadelson published in 1985 what has become the standard text of the field. It's called Guitar Making, Tradition, and Technology. But it's been in print now for 35 years, and it's so long in the tooth. It's quite obsolete now. It's got a lot of good information, but we've been working for the last 5 or 6 years for an updated version that includes all the new techniques and the new tools that are now available for the student. And our building has also improved over the last 30 years too. So the new edition that we're working on that may come out by the end of this year, perhaps next year, will be the revised edition of the standard textbook in guitar making.
Well, you will have that information on your webpage, right?
Yes, that will be announced on my webpage.
That's very good. So it's
Also,
Cumpiano.com.
the other book was the summary of the 20 years of research that our group, El Proyecto del Cuatro Puertorriqueño, did, and it's called Cuerdas de mi Tierra,
Which means?
the strings of my land.
Yes.
And it's the first book of original research into the origins of the Puerto Rican musical artisanal traditions in Puerto Rico. And it covers not only the cuatro, but the family of Puerto Rican string instrument, cuatro, tiple, bordonua. And the fact is that there were many different cuatros, there were many different tiples, there were many different bordonuas, and they all disappeared, save for the modern cuatro, which is the only survivor.
Uh-huh. Well, William, thank you so very much. It has been such a pleasure to have you here. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners as well. So thank you so much.
Well, the pleasure has been mine.
And you'll have to
Thank
come
you for
back,
inviting me.
please. Thank you.
I certainly will.
Yes, great. Thank you so much.